Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are. Hosted by Desiree Duffy.
It is time once again for us to have some book-ish fun. Hi, I'm Desiree Duffy, and welcome to Books That Make You. We're talking about books that make you travel back in history. Yeah, we're talking about historical fiction. These stories pay really close attention to the time period and the voice, the behaviors, what society was like, and all these other amazing details of the period that's depicted. Now, historical fiction books are often meticulously researched, and they really do provide a glimpse into life in another time. And isn't that one of the most delicious things that we can experience? As readers, being able to go back in time and vicariously living through characters in our novel. Now, that's why we love reading, right? Now, if we can also learn about the past, well, then that is so much better. As well, when we learn about the past, the cool thing, we also learn about our present, don't we? And even sometimes our future. Our guest is Diana Giovinazzo, and she is an expert when it comes to historical fiction, as that is what her forthcoming book is. She's also one of the hosts of the popular podcast Wine, Women, Words, and she's also part of the LA chapter of the Women's National Book Association. That's right. Diana has a lot going on. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. So, all right, let me ask you the big question, Diana.
Okay.
Why do you think people are attracted to historical fiction?
I think they're attracted to it because when you read historical fiction, you read it to feel what it was like to be back there. A lot of the authors that I hang around with, and myself included, will say, I read history to learn. I read historical fiction to feel. You can get a sense of what it's like to have to deal with the emotions that are around the time, the having to be in the midst of a war, to having to deal with oppression and things of that nature that actually happen. And so there's a much more broader sense to it than if you're just to pick up a history book that tells you these are the facts. In 1776, we had a war, and that was it. So you don't get that sense and that feeling of what was going on.
Yeah, exactly. It can be cold, almost sterile to just learn history, its names and its dates and its wars, and it feels like if you really want to learn history that way, you're doing a lot of memorizing and not really experiencing it.
Exactly. And you get that one-sided version of it. They always say history is written by the winners. In historical fiction, you don't always look at it from the winner's perspective. You can look at it from the loser's perspective, or you can look at it from the people who don't get to have a say during those times in the historical record. You get to hear from their perspective too. And I think that in and of itself has been a really big pull for historical fiction. And it's also why you see a lot of historical fiction centered around women, because traditionally women were not allowed in politics or any of the big decision-making stuff. So their stories didn't get recorded in the historical record. And for those few who did, they kind of got scrubbed a little bit. So you don't really get to see much unless you really look closely.
And it's interesting, too, because it reminds me a little bit of Shakespeare's sister, the allegory by Virginia Woolf, where basically she was saying even as writers, women didn't necessarily have the same opportunities as men. So men were writing, obviously, about other men, but you didn't get as many of the stories about women.
Absolutely. And even when women wrote, they had to write under pseudonyms, like with the Bronte sisters. They had to write under a pseudonym of a man. And then you had Mary Shelley, who had to publish Frankenstein anonymously. And it wasn't until years later that her name was even associated with her own work.
That's really true. And that's a fascinating story, too, because she was known for having the fling with Percy Shelley. Mm-hmm. And that famous night where she was inspired to write Frankenstein, he was there along with some others. And then there was those after the fact who still wanted to attribute the writing of the book to him and not her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's always been a struggle for women to get their stories out there and their works out there. And historical fiction is in some ways filling in those gaps. It reminds me a lot of Eliza Hamilton. Mm-hmm. My Dear Hamilton came out, I want to say it was just last year, and I was recently at a speaking engagement with one of the authors, and she was talking about how when she was doing her initial research into Eliza Hamilton, they didn't really plan on writing about her because the idea that we get from her, even from the musical, is that she's this very angelic person. She could do no wrong. She's this virtuous woman above reproach. And she was going through some old letters in I want to say it was the Library of Congress, and one of the letters was from her sister Angelica. And it was to somebody else, and she doesn't know what the subject matter was, but Angelica said, Eliza needs to give this person a dressing down in only the way that Eliza can.
Okay, what did that mean? That sounds interesting.
Exactly, and dressing down in that time was basically the same thing as what we say now is to tell off someone. Ah. And it's only a sister can be like, yeah, you need to go, my sister needs to go handle this and have a few words with this woman. And nobody knows you as well as like your sisters or your spouses. And Hamilton even wrote in one of his letters that after he got fired from the army with George Washington, that he was afraid to go home. Eliza was going to kill him. And so there was this really fierce woman who was invested in her husband's career beyond just being this virtuous woman that history made her out to be. And so you see that happen time and time again. And this is a way for women to look at the historical record more closely, to correct those inaccuracies, to give a spin to it, to look at it from a woman's perspective, too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and here's the thing, Diana. Mm-hmm. Women are people, too.
Really? I'm a person, too? This is so novel.
I know, right? But you hit it right on the head that a lot of times women are portrayed. It goes back to you're saying she was portrayed very angelically. Mm-hmm. So either we're angelic or we're the opposite. Mm-hmm. We are kind of thrust into these archetypes. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that we have flaws, and mm-hmm. that's okay. And some of us are mean, and some of us are sweet, and we're a variation of all of that at different times in our life. Mm-hmm. And to kind of just wash that away and sanitize it, mm-hmm. that really is just an error against, women as being humans.
Absolutely. And there's just so much that, I found through reading historical fiction. It's one of the things that made me fall in love with it is that I learned things from it that I never learned in school. Like, did you know that women during the Civil War would dress up as men and go out to war and fight in the war?
Oh, I did not know that.
I didn't know that either until I picked up a little book called I Shall Be Near to You by Erin Lindsay Mccabe. And it tells a story that was inspired by a real woman who dressed up like a man. She changed her name to be like a man, and she went out and followed her husband into war because she did not want to leave his side, and she wanted to fight right next to him through the whole thing. And there were many, many women during the Civil War who weren't just nurses as we were taught in school. Mm-hmm. These were women who wanted to go be with their fathers and their brothers. They didn't want to be left alone on the homestead. They wanted to fight for their battles. And they were fierce soldiers. And nobody ever talked about that. And I never learned about that until her book. And so that also spurred me to go pick up actual history books and to go look at actual histories of women who actually lived through it to learn more about it. So it helps regenerate that interest in our history.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. And you're right. I can remember being in second grade and we decided the teacher wanted us to do a Civil War reenactment. Mm-hmm. And to this day, I remember all the girls were nurses and all the boys were soldiers. Mm-hmm. And I remember asking, I want to be on that side. Can I be a soldier? And no, you weren't allowed. And so it is exactly that. If that's what you're taught, then that's all you know. And bravo for you for, doing the research and reading that book. Can you give the name of the book and the author one more time? I just want to
Sure. It's called I Shall Be Near to You by Erin, Lindsay, Mccabe.
Fantastic. Now, one of the things that you touched on, too, that I think is important is the fact that when you read historical fiction, it inspires you to want to learn and read more. Mm-hmm. I did that after reading The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. Yes. I mean, you like learning about, you heard about Henry VIII and all his wives and obviously Anne Boleyn. But when I read that book, I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Did that happen? Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's one of the great things about it is that, are these things true? The stuff that we find in history is so much more scandalous and tantalizing than anything I could have ever imagined. And these are things that actually happen to people for the good or bad or mischievous. It actually happened.
Yeah.
It's better than fiction.
Let me ask your expert opinion on this. How true does someone writing historical fiction have to be to reality? I mean, are there rules? Are there best practices? What should readers expect as far as facts or truth when reading historical fiction?
This is so often debated, even between readers and authors, you name it. When it comes to historical fiction, you've got to get the big stuff right. Readers will forgive you if you move up some dates, on some things, but like the big stuff. I read one book. I won't name it, but it had to do with Hamilton, and it was god awful wrong. Like they got things like the Schuyler family didn't like Hamilton. They didn't want her to marry Hamilton. They wanted her to marry a loyalist. And they didn't actually go into any historical research at all. They just based it off the musical. Mm-hmm. And the musical is historical fiction, and the musical is very well done. But the musical, as historical fiction, has flaws. He took his own license to it, and this ended up being like a bit of the telephone game. And you can't stray that far away from it because, especially if you're dealing with real people's lives, you can't just decide, well, so I'm going to decide that her parents really didn't like him and they didn't want her to marry him, so I'm going to create this whole issue between them. When in reality, that wasn't an issue. They knew everything and they wanted her to marry him. He was a good catch for her. So you've got to have those big things right. And you've got to have, show that you've done as much research as possible. And yes, even though you have to put down your pen and write a good story at the end of the day, you still need to be able to have some research backing you up.
Well, and you also can do a disservice to history because a lot of times we do start remembering history based on fiction. Mm-hmm, and there's an assumption, like you said, that those big points are going to be accurate. And if they're not, then that becomes what people remember, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and people will ask for your resources. It's like you're back in school writing your history report. What are your resources? Where did you get the ideas for these storylines for? Why did you make something go this way and not this way? Like, it was funny now that I've been so much into historical fiction and started writing historical fiction. I watched Zorro for the first time. It was like The Mask of Zorro. The second one where the California is going to go into the Union. And I'm watching it, and then all of a sudden I'm like, well, that plot point can't happen. Like, the basic premise, not giving away any spoilers, the characters are forced to divorce. This is the 19th century. Women didn't really have that luxury of just divorcing on a whim. So I'm like, right there, I'm like, I've got a problem with this plot. Mm-hmm. But it's okay, because it's Hollywood. And then at the end, Abraham Lincoln shows up. And I look at my husband and I was like, Abraham Lincoln never came to California. And I've been so bothered by this. And this movie came out, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can't look at this movie the same way again. Even like the words that you use, you have to I've had to go back and look at the origins of words. To see if these certain words were actually used during the time period that I was writing in. Because strangely enough, readers will ding us on that. Like the word, trek? Trek was originated in the late 1800s in the United States when wagoners would trek across the country in their wagons. And my book took place in South America, and it was before that time, so that word wasn't used. So I had to change a whole paragraph so that I could avoid the word trek. And I was watching Rob Roy a couple weeks ago, and they used the word shag. And I was like, they didn't use shag back then. That's too modern. And I had to go. I've got a website that I go to, and I went and looked it up, and I was like, I was right. They didn't use it back then.
I had a similar experience with beef jerky. I put beef jerky in something that I wrote set in several hundred years back, and my editor pointed out, you know what? They didn't have beef jerky back then. That was, I think it came around in, during the 1800s, during the time of the Old West. And I was like, but they had dried meat. Isn't that the same thing? And she was just like, no, you can't say beef jerky. So I think I opted for saying jerk beef or some kind of play on words because I really wanted to convey that it was like beef jerky.
Yeah. Yeah, you've got to work within the rules of that time period where you've got to have the language, you've got to have the clothing. You can't put a microwave in the middle of the 19th century. So you've got to really figure these things out. And so those are really the big rules. It's just having the world set properly, having the language set properly, and just having the big stuff down. And then, oftentimes in an author's note, you can say, well, I had to choose to up this time frame or, move this battle. Because we understand it's fiction. You have some license, but it's not fantasy and it's not 100% fiction because you got to have that research behind you.
Now, what about, you mentioned Abraham Lincoln. What if he becomes a vampire hunter? What the heck is that all about?
That is a very, very, very liberal take on historical fiction. I tried to read that book. I could not get into that book.
Oh. Was it too much of a stretch for you? Is that why?
Yeah, I think it was. It was too much of a stretch. I found it kind of dry, too, as a read. And even as a movie, I was like, okay, I'm going to watch the movie. I like the movie. And I just couldn't get in the movie. Now, you give me something like Gail Carriger's, her books. She does the Parasol Protectorate series, which I loved. And it's Victorian era with vampires and werewolves. And all sorts of other, supernatural creatures. And obviously that's fantasy, because they were not walking around London at that time, but it's very much set within that world. Queen Victoria is still Queen Victoria. She's aware of everything that's going on, but she's not a vampire hunter.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think it all depends on how it's done and how it's portrayed.
Sure. And there's the books, too, the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Mm-hmm.
And that got turned into a movie as well. And that's just a lot of fun.
They are. I love that one. I love that book. I read that, and I read Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters.
I just love the names, too.
Right? They were fun books. They were fun takes, and those are retellings. And, something like that is fun. Mm-hmm. In and of itself. It's like when you retell a fairy tale with the fairy tale retellings. You're able to take the license with that, but you still have that structure of Sense and Sensibility, or you still have that structure of Pride and Prejudice, or that original fairy tale. That structure's still there. You're just playing with it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me, you've mentioned several authors and books.
Mm-hmm.
What are you reading right now, or what do you recommend for people who really want to take a deep dive into historical fiction?
Okay, well, I Shall Be Near to You is definitely at the top of that list. One of the other ones I actually just finished this weekend, Learning to See by Elise Hooper. It's actually our book of the month for Wine, Women, and Words. And it takes a look at the life of Dorothea Lange. And I think that's a great one to look at. She's the woman, the photographer, that captured the Great Depression and the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Her photography was amazing, and so this is her story, and it's another one of those really great looks at women in history, because she didn't really get a lot of credit until later in her life because the government held on to a lot of her photographs. So there, that one's great. It was a really quick read. Woman 99 just came out today.
Okay.
By my friend and author Greer McAllister.
Ooh.
I asked. Yes. love her books. This one deals with, and it's kind of been in the topic, in the news a little bit, because we heard about Charles Dickens wanting to put his wife into an asylum, because men back in the 19th century could do that.
Mm-hmm.
And this story is inspired by Nellie Bly, who was a reporter that got herself put into a mental hospital to find her sister.
Mm-hmm.
And she did this whole expose on women in the hospitals. Actually, she didn't go find her sister. I'm sorry, I take that back. I was wrong on that. But she went in there to see what it was like in these insane asylums, that women could be put in there for being too promiscuous, too loud, too emotional. And she went through and exposed all of that. And because of her work, that she's the reason why we have so many restrictions that we do today and safeguards for patients. And that's all because of her. So this story, Woman 99, is inspired by that. And Greer's also done two other really great books. She did Girl in Disguise, which was about the first female detective. She was with the Pinkertons, mm-hmm. and she helped stop a plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. There was more than one. One succeeded, and she was not on that case. But the one she was on, she was able to stop. And then Greer also did one that I absolutely love called The Magician's Lie. Mm-hmm. And it's a story about a illusionist in the 19th century. And it's her story, how she became an illusionist, being an illusionist. And, and then there's also a bit of a whodunit kind of mystery. Did she actually kill a guy on stage? Did she actually saw him in half? And did she, the story that she's telling, is it a good story? Is it a true story? Mm. So it was a really well done book. So I recommend any of Greer's books, but especially Woman 99 since it just came out.
Yeah, that sounds like a good one. That's an excellent list. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Now, you've mentioned Wine, Women, Words. Let's talk about that really quick.
Okay.
Describe your show and tell us about your co-host and the authors you like to talk to.
Well, in a nutshell, we get drunk and talk about books. We're a very simple show. We drink wine and we discuss books. We have authors on every week, and we don't really have a set designation for authors that we like. It's pretty much whatever books that come past us that strike our fancy. That sounds like something that we'd be interested in, that our audience would be interested in. We'll pick up and see. And we do a book of the month every month that we read together and we discuss, in addition to interviewing authors. As I mentioned, our current book of the month is Learning to See, and then Woman 99 is actually our April book of the month. And so we'll have the authors on of those books of the month at the end of the month to discuss their book with us.
I love it. I love it. Let's talk a little bit about your writing, because you have a forthcoming historical fiction book, and I want to hear more about that specifically.
I do. My historical fiction novel is called The Woman in Red, and it's a novel of Anita Garibaldi. And Anita Garibaldi is the woman, most people, if anybody knows, if you know a lot about Italian history, you'll know the name Giuseppe Garibaldi. Mm-hmm. And he was the man who united Italy in the 19th century. Well, what most people don't know is that his wife, who died in the early part of the Unification Wars, was a young woman from Brazil. And he had gotten himself exiled from Italy, and he discovered her. They met each other in Brazil and fell in love. And she's just this amazing woman. And she's all of those things that we talked about in historical fiction. You know, she's all of those things, where she's somebody who's in some ways has gotten scrubbed down to this one picture of a person. Where in Italy, she's very much the mother figure. In Brazil and Uruguay, she's very much this folk hero. But in a lot of places, she's just a footnote in Garibaldi's story. Mm-hmm. And she was just an amazing, badass woman.
I love it. And you are Italian.
I am.
Doing this story, did that feel especially close to you? Is that why you did it, or is it a coincidence? Tell us about your connection, how you personally felt.
For me, it was a part of learning more about my history, learning about the Italian history, because we have this ideal in the U.S. that if you're Italian, you're either part of the mafia, mm-hmm. or you're part of Jersey Shore, and there's really, when it comes down to it, there's so much more to my culture than mafia and meatballs.
Yes.
And one of the problems, and one of the reasons why we have such an emphasis on the mafia, and even Christopher Columbus, because I know that comes up periodically, and we have so many Italians that are attached to him, even though he was this complete and total jerk. It's because we don't know enough about our history. We don't know about, I didn't know that Italy didn't become a country until the 1860s. And, a fully unified country. And, I didn't know about Anita, and I didn't know about all of these people like John Basilone, who was this great war hero. And I feel we need to learn more about these people. And so I was researching something else, and my father came across Anita, and he was like, "Oh, you should read this. Read about her." And I was like, yeah, okay, Dad, okay. And he was like, no, you need to read this. You'll love her. And I was like, but I'm also reading this other thing right now. And didn't you tell me I need to finish what I started? And he was like, no, you need to read this. And he wouldn't stop nagging me. And it doesn't matter how old you are never above your parents nagging you. So
True.
So I picked up this a book on Anita, and I fell in love with her story, and I just felt so inspired. And at the same time, I started to get angry because she was that footnote in Garibaldi's story. And after she died, years after she died, he called her the queen of his soul and the woman that he still cried for.
Aww.
And this is like decades after this is his life that he wrote that about her. Because he went on to live until he was, I want to say, close to his 80s. around that time. And so there was a good, 20 years that he was without her. And so this was somebody who was really important to him. And she left a lasting impression in not one, but 3 different countries, 2 different continents. And, when I was looking at some of the stuff that people talked about her, there were these, they would say things about, well, this is what she thought. And it's like, women don't think that way. That's not how a woman would process this. And then there were, and other things that angered me was that a lot of books got things wrong. There were no 2 books that were the same on researching her. I think that was my biggest frustration, was that I had to constantly go back and double check my resources against each other because not everything was the same. And I remember picking up one book, and it was so funny because it was this book. It was more about Garibaldi and about his history, because I needed to learn some more about him to input some stuff for Anita. And the first chapter was he met her in Brazil, and against her father's wishes, he took her away. Problem is, her father was dead.
Oh.
Died when she was 12. 2, 3, or 4 other books said her father died when she was 12. But this person who was writing about Garibaldi didn't take the time to actually do proper research on Anita.
Right.
And that upset me a lot. And I was like, I just started to write this story, and it just kind of like, it felt like there was a story that needed to be told, and I became very attached to it, and became very attached to Anita because of it.
Oh my God. Well, I can't wait for the book to come out, and I wish this show was more than a half hour long because we're almost out of time. But before we leave, can you tell people again, give us the name of the book so they know what to look for when it comes out, because it's going to come out eventually, but it's going to be a little while. So I just want people to be able to make that footnote, and then let people know where they can find you online, or more about you, and as well as your show, the Wine Women Words. Yeah, absolutely.
The book is going to be called, as of right now, it's going to be called The Woman in Red, a novel of Anita Garibaldi, and you can find me, Wine Women in Words. We are on iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, you name it. You can also find us on Instagram under Wine Women in Words, or just Wine Women Words. I'm sorry, Wine Women Words on Instagram. And then for me, you can go to Diana Giovinazzo, and that's spelled Giovinazzo.com. I know it's a mouthful, guys.
It is.
But there's links to Wine Women in Words is probably going to be the easiest place to go. Wine Women in Words podcast.com. There's links back to my website. If you guys are interested in my book, I do have a newsletter that's going to be coming out later this month. So you can sign up for that and get updates on the book, find some behind the scenes stuff, like what music I listened to while I wrote the book, some little history tidbits, and maybe a little bit about the next book.
Ooh, I love it. I love it. Well, Diana, thank you again so much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. And once again, my name is Desiree Duffy, and thank you, everyone, for being with us today on Books That Make You. And you can find out more about us on our website. It's booksthatmakeyou.com. And you can also follow on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, enjoy all of the books that make you who you are.
The executive producer for Books That Make You is Desiree Duffy. Produced and sound mastered by Phil Giangrande. Engineering by Dave Napox. Social media and promotion by Bree Sweeter. For more, visit booksthatmakeyou.com.